The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
So today, what we want to do is we want to talk about this idea of autoregulation, right? So what happens when a gene regulates its own expression? And I think that this is a really nice topic because it really encapsulates several of the big themes that we're going to be seeing throughout the semester, right? So first, there's this idea of a network motif, right? So this motif, it's the simplest possible motif where a gene regulates itself. It occurs more frequently than you expect by chance. We'll kind of explain what we mean by that. And then possibly an evolutionary explanation is that this thing may be advantageous in one way or another. Okay? Now, there are two basic kinds of negative autoregulation, two basic kinds of autoregulation. There's negative and positive. All right? So negative means that protein represses its own expression. Positive autoregulation would mean that it is activating or upregulating its own expression. Okay? So down here is positive autoregulation. All right, and these things have very different possible purposes. All right, we'll see that there are basically two things that negative autoregulation might do for us. First is that it speeds the on time relative to simple sort of no regulation. But the other thing is kind of an interesting thing, which is that the protein concentration is somehow robust. All right. Robust means that it's comparatively non-sensitive or insensitive to something. In particular, this means protein concentration is robust to say, fluctuations in the production rate. Okay. And in various contexts, we're going to see how robustness is an important goal that biology might have, in particular a cell might have, and that you would like this protein concentration to be robust to a wide range of things. But in this case, anytime you talk about robustness, you have to say, all right, it's robust. What is it that's robust against what? In this case, it's protein concentration is robust to fluctuations in the production rate. Right. Now, positive autoregulation, on the other hand, in some ways makes these two things worse. We'll kind of discuss what we mean by that. But it perhaps performs some other functions. In particular, it allows for the possibility of bistability and hence memory. And we'll kind of explain how memory appears in this process. Right. But before we get into autoregulation, I just want to do a quick review of this thing about sort of getting intuition about biochemical binding of activators, for example, to the promoter, but also how we can use this thing about sequestration in order to generate what we call this ultrasensitive response. Okay. Now, when we talk about this, we're often thinking about a question that we'd like the rate of expression of some gene to be sensitive or be ultrasensitive to the concentration of something. Right? So if you have, say, X activating Y, then what you might like in many cases is for there to be an essentially digital response, where if you think about the production rate of Y as a function of this input X, you might like it to just be very sharp, right? To be essentially 0, quickly to come up, and then saturate it at some level, beta maybe. Okay. Now, the question is, how is it that you can do that? And one thing that we discussed that could get you something kind of like this. Does anybody remember what the base solution might be?
Cooperative regulation.
Right, cooperative regulation. Right. So if it's the case that you have, for example, a tetramer of X that is somehow activating Y, then you can get something that looks maybe not this sharp, but much sharper than what you would get, which is the simple michaelis-menten type looking curve if you just had a single monomer of X activating Y. Right. So one solution is indeed cooperativity. But I think that there's another interesting one that is this, second solution is this idea of molecular titration. Okay. And I kind of explained the basic idea at the end of the lecture on on Tuesday, but then what we want to do is try to get a sense of what the requirements might be for the kind of the bindings in order to generate this effect. All right, so what we have is a situation where we have, again, just X is regulating Y. Okay? But it's a little bit more complicated because this protein X, in addition to binding the promoter and activating expression of Y, we also have the possibility that X can bind to something else. Okay? Right, in particular, there might be some other protein, maybe W, which can bind reversibly into some complex WX. Okay? Now, for some situations, in particular, if this is, if we describe this by some KW and this by some KD, right, we can ask, in what regime will this generate an ultra-sensitive response, where, as a function of the total concentration of X, right? So we might want to, we might want to, for example, call that X total, just to be clear, right? We'd like it that there's very little expression of Y, but then all of a sudden to get kind of maximal, if you like, expression of Y. And the question is, well, what do we need in terms of these KW, KDs, and so forth? Okay? All right, so there are going to be 3 different conditions that we're going to kind of play with. All right. First might be the relationship between this KD, all right, the affinity of binding of that transcription factor to the promoter, as compared to this KW. All right, I will write some options, but as always, you should start thinking. You don't need to watch me write. Don't know again. So I'll give you just 30 seconds to think about it. Yes?
KW like the dissociation constant? Like is it concentration W times concentration of X over the...
Right, so it's the guy that has units of concentration.
Okay.
Right, so lower in both these cases corresponds to tighter binding. And I'll let you think for 20 seconds maybe. All right. Do you need more time? And it's OK if you are not 100% convinced of something. It's useful to just make a guess, and then we can discuss. Shall we go for it? All right, everybody have your tools in front of you? All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. OK. All right, so we have, I'd say, a fair amount of disagreement, actually. I'd say we got some A's, B's, C's. Everybody, well, not everybody, I don't know. There might be 1 or 2 D's. All right, so yeah, why don't we go ahead and turn to a neighbor. You should definitely be able to find a neighbor that disagrees with you. All right, so, and try to convince them that you, yeah, all right, so, oh yeah, sorry. OK, no. All right, so the question is, what conditions do these things need in order to have an ultra-sensitive response, where the rate of production of what? Yeah.
Okay, so there's definitely this is not right. So that all of the W binds all the that's
right, why don't we go ahead and reconvene, and maybe I'll just get a sense of what the state of your thinking is right now. All right, so once again, the question is, we want to know what relationship between all these binding affinities, concentrations has to be in order to get an ultra-sensitive response, where as a function of the total amount of x, you kind of add x. At first, you don't get really much of any expression of y, but then all of a sudden, you get a lot. Okay? And first, we want to know the relationship between KD and KW. Okay, let's go ahead and vote. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, what? We're still on this one. So yeah, you can ignore these. It's just it takes me time to write. So I wanted to take advantage of your discussion. Yeah, no, we're still on this one. Do you guys understand what I'm trying to ask? Okay, all right, ready? All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, I'm going to cover this so nobody gets confused. All right, so we have a fair pocket of C's back there, but then a fair, some other distributions. All right, so or you got some discussion over here. So maybe somebody can offer their insight. Well, yeah, what did your neighbor think?
My neighbor thought that so at first there should not be the binding between the x and to the gene. So x should bind much more easily with w.
Okay.
That's why KW should be.
All right, so you're arguing that you want KW to be much smaller than KD here, because as you add x, you want it initially for them all to be sequestered by molecule W. Is that okay? All right. So does somebody else want to? Somebody's neighbor thought it should instead be B. Could you want to offer their argument? Everybody's neighbor is now convinced that C is. All right, so I'm gonna side with that. Right. So the idea here is that what you'd really like is, in principle, if that KW is perfect, and that corresponds to going to 0, right? Then that means that if you plot the free x as a function of x total, then what does it start out being if KW is 0? 0, right? All right. And when thinking about the concentration of free x, do we have to think about or worry about how much x is bound to the promoter? No, we'll say that, that so long as you have any reasonable concentration of x, then the one x that binds to that promoter, binds to that DNA, is not going to affect the concentration of free x. All right, so we really just have to worry about how much is bound to W. Okay? All right, so it's going to be 0, and this is in the limit of KW going to 0, right? And all right, and so when is it that something starts happening?
When x is the concentration of W.
Right. So it's when you get and is it the concentration of W, or is it, maybe we can be a little bit more precise? What should I actually write here? Should I just write W, or should I write W total? I think you're right, because the free W is changing all the time, and indeed, as you approach here, the free W goes to 0, right? So over here, the free W is equal to WT, but then it decreases linearly until you get here. And now there's no free W. And it's at that stage that this free x is going to go up with a slope of what? 1, right? Right, exactly. All the x that you add just turns into free x. Right, so this goes up with slope 1. Okay? So this is the idea behind this mechanism. Right? This is what I'm drawing is the case of perfect sequestration. Right? And in this case, what happens is, if you look at the production rate of y, all right, as a function again of x total, all right, the production rate in here is going to be equal to what? 0. Right? Until you get to this WT, and then it's going to come up. And how is it going to come up? Does it immediately come all the way up to maximal? No. So what determines how rapidly that's going to happen? The concentration of free x. And we actually know what the concentration of free x is here now. Right, so it's the KD of the binding. Right? So this is going to be some, all right, so this is, again, a michaelis-menten looking kind of curve, right? Where the half maximal here is just going to be this WT plus that KD. Okay? All right, so this is there's a sense that this is ultra sensitive because initially you don't get much of any expression, then all of a sudden you start getting kind of significant amounts. Okay. All right, are there any questions about the intuition here? I mean, we still have to kind of come back and think a little bit more carefully, kind of quantitatively, about what this mechanism means for the other comparisons. But at least based on this idea of the perfect situation where the sequestration of W with X is complete, then this is kind of the idea of what's going on. All right, is it clear right now? Yeah.
What's the direction of KW in this situation? Is that
In what I'm drawing here? Or
this is what you drew there.
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, OK. So right. Well, the definition of KW is going to be that KW, and this is a definition, right? It has units of concentration, so that means we have to put up, this is the concentration of W, concentration of X, concentration of WX, right?
Oh, so that's a big K.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about this? Yeah.
So why is the slope of the free x 1? Because isn't some of the x now binding with the gene?
OK, right. So this is what we were saying, is that there's just one copy of this gene.
Oh, okay.
Right. So so given that there might be, in this case, this might be 1,000 of these protein, then it's just not a significant. Yeah. Yeah. In the back. OK, so in this class, whenever possible, at least in the lectures, so we'll always try to stick with the dissociation constant, which is the guy that has units of concentration. You can also talk about the association constant, and then they also use K for that. Horribly confusing, right? So whenever possible, I'll be referring to the dissociation constant.
That makes the lowercase k the big K's.
Oh, that's right. No, it's a good thing that my K's are so clearly big K's that there's no possible source for confusion there. Right. Yes. But if you're ever confused about which K or whatnot I'm referring to, please just ask. Okay. All right. Any other questions about the basic mechanism? Yeah.
Just to clarify, so if we take the other limit for KD going to 0, would it be the same, so free x versus x total, would it be the same slope but starting from 0?
Right.
Shifted left?
Oh, OK. Oh, the other limit of KD going to 0. Yeah, so all right, this is an interesting point. Right, so I think this plot is sort of independent of KD, because binding to that promoter doesn't affect the free concentration of X anyways. Right? It does affect this, though, right? Because if KD kind of gets smaller and smaller, then this curve actually gets more and more steep. Okay. Does that answer your question? OK, right. OK. Yes, OK, that's a good point. Right, so that's a question of, but now you're taking two limits of things going to 0, so we have to be a little bit careful, right? I mean, because it still maybe depends on what, the relationship between those two as they go to 0. Yeah. So we'll maybe, yes. OK, so no, that's fair. But the idea is that if you're in this other limit, then you end up not having significant sequestration in the sense that as you start adding X, you start getting expression of that protein early on, and so then the whole mechanism doesn't work, right? So it's true that in principle that thing is steep, but it was never inhibited to begin with, right? Because the moment you started adding X, you start getting expression from the gene. Okay. Are there other questions about that? All right, let's try out this next one. All right. Now this is question of K, right, so this is the binding affinity of X to that sequesterer as compared to the total amount of that W. All right, so what's going to be the requirement there? So we'll go ahead and give you 30 seconds to kind of.
Excuse me, but don't we already have what we wanted? Right? Like, what's this more specific question?
Right, OK, so here, this is the case where W went to 0. Or KW went to 0. Right, so that's, and indeed, this works. And the question is, in general, I mean, KW is not actually going to be equal to 0. So the question is, does, and it might be relevant for this question still. But yeah, all right, but it's, yeah, because I mean, in some ways, this is the idealized version. And any real thing is going to have just some numbers for these things. The question is, will those numbers work, right? All right, do you need more time? All right, let's go ahead and make our best guess. All right, in order to get ultra-sensitivity in response to of y to concentration of x, what is it that you need here? All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, so we got some A's, some B's, some D's. C is not very popular. OK. All right, OK, so it seems like, OK, well, yeah, why don't we, let's go ahead and spend 30 seconds. Turn to your neighbor. You should be able to find someone that disagrees with you.
All you're doing is you're moving the bottom, right? This is it's a spider. Right. It's not how many KW with the stability is much smaller, right? My thought was that you definitely a lot of
OK, why don't we go ahead and reconvene, and you can give your argument to the group. All right, does somebody want to volunteer an explanation? Yeah.
I haven't had time to test this explanation.
That's just fine. Well, your neighbor will appreciate,
So I was thinking that the timescale of like that axis really on the second graph is set by how quickly that slope, the curving slope rises.
OK, so time scale I'm a little bit worried about.
Scale.
OK, all right.
So, yeah, it's sort of set by how quickly that curve, the second curve, rises once you go above 0.
OK.
That's sort of the only feature on that graph.
OK.
And that should be in like a michaelis-menten sense determined by k.
K, which K?
Oh, the k of the KD.
Yes.
Oh no.
OK, right. So I think I like everything you're saying, although I think you're about to answer the next one.
Yes.
Although the next one I think is in some ways the hardest one. So you're
KD,
ready.
Right. Which we've determined should be a lot more than KW.
Right. So we know that KD should be more than a lot more than KW.
And I think that this should be a decent amount less than, so I think that KD should be a decent amount smaller than WT.
All right, so you think KD should be a decent amount smaller than W2. OK, so you really are answering the next question. All right.
But no, I think that this is important.
Oh, no, I agree it's important. It's, but
I think, well, anyway. But it's just that, basically speaking, if you let WT become too small, then in comparison to everything else, all the relevant quantities, then this feature, which is really determining the ultrasensitivity, shrinks to have 0 size.
Okay.
That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, yeah, no, I very much like that explanation.
Okay.
And since we have it on tape, we can now play it again in a few minutes, and then everything. No, right, yeah, okay. I think that you're making a very nice argument, and actually, we'll go ahead and even. Does anybody want to argue against? Yeah. Right. So what he's arguing is that yeah. So he's actually arguing that it's this over here, which is that what sets the scale that this thing increases by is the KD, right? And you want and you want this thing to kind of come up quickly relative to this other scale, which is the total W, right? So if total W is just like too small here, then it's not like you get any ultra-sensitive response, right? Because you want it to be kind of like low, 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 and then come up kind of quickly. So there's some sense that you want this scale to be of order this scale, or maybe even a bit shorter. Is that? I mean, was that? Yeah. And I agree that this is actually one that generates a lot of argument and discussion in general, because it's, because I think reasonable people can disagree, right? But I think that this is actually I will side with you on this. Okay. But does any? All right. But yeah. So but what about this comparison? Because you haven't said anything about KW, right? So
I think combining one and
Okay, fine. No,
that's why I was trying to answer.
Okay, no. You're okay, fair enough. But but it's just too many logical leaps. Okay, no, I think it's true, and there's a reason that I ordered the questions in this way, so that this one you could, Otherwise, I agree that if you combine these things, you do get. And which one do you get?
I think A.
Is that what other people got?
Yes.
Okay, and all right. And is there? Okay, I agree that actually you can get to A here from the combination of C and B here, but it's a little bit crazy. Is there a more direct explanation we can give? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you don't have a lot of W,
Okay.
then your binding is too sensitive in a way. Like you'll add a little bit of X, and then the binding will all be used up, and you'll be making Y immediately.
Yes.
You want a lot of W to be able to soak up a sizable amount.
Right. You want and I guess okay, yeah. Go and maybe in the back.
So, originally I agreed, but that doesn't really, that just makes your switch compact. It makes, as you said, you can sequester less.
Yep.
But that still gives you a sensitive switch, right? It doesn't necessarily. You're more sensitive to fluctuations if you have a lower sequestration capacity, but it doesn't really change. You still have that switch.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I think that this is actually subtle, all right, because there are two ways that having more of this WT helps. Right. One is that it pushes this boundary further to the right, but the other is that it makes it kind of a better sequestering agent because there are just more of these W's to bind. And if you go and you do the calculation, I encourage you to do it. What you actually find is that the concentration of free X is given approximately by X total divided by WT over K sub W. Okay. So what you see is that the free concentration of X, and this is in the region. This is for X total less than and maybe significantly less than W total. Okay. Right. But the idea is that when you're in this sequestering regime, what you see is the concentration of X. It's going to increase linearly with a total X, but it's going to be kind of sort of suppressed by this amount here. Okay, where this ratio is much larger than 1, right? Because you want to be much larger than 1, WT over KW, right? And this is kind of telling you how good of a sequester this W is, because you want to bind tightly and you need to have kind of enough to keep the free concentration of X from growing. Okay. All right. Yes?
So that's what I was thinking as well. But then I was wondering if there's too much of W, then wouldn't X never bind to the promoter? It'll just always get sequestered?
Yes. All right. So this is a very important point, which is that it needs to be possible for the cell to make enough X to overcome the W, right? I mean, if if there's so much of this sequestering protein that you cannot even get beyond that, then you're never, I mean, it's true that you might have a nice ultra-sensitive switch out there, but you just can't get there, right? So yeah, so this is certainly relevant as well. Yeah. Okay. All right, so incidentally, if you plot free x as a function of xt on a log scale, okay, the question is what is it going to look like, right? And that we know that on a linear scale, it looks something like that, right? So if it's on a log scale, the question is, and log is nice because you can really get the full dynamic range of what's going on, right? So if you plot x and this is free x, right, as a function of x total in this regime, right? For large x and x total, what is it going to end up looking like? It's a straight line, okay? And eventually it's going to be a straight line with slope 1, actually, right? Because they're just linearly related to each other. Now, down in the low regime, what is it going to look like for small, well below this region of WT? Yeah.
The equation you gave is also going to be a straight line, just not with slope 1.
With what slope?
With slope 1 over WT, k over k.
Okay, so this is. Does everybody agree? No, we have a disagreeable. No. All right. So wait, what's the?
I think it's going to be also slope 1, but just shifted.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So it's actually also slope 1, but it has a lower. All right. So this is dangerous. I mean, this is why I brought this up, just because it's really easy to kind of look at these things and think that, yeah, because they're still linearly related to each other. So when you take the logs, it just affects the level. Okay. So you still get the same slope, but it's going to be kind of down here somewhere. And then in this regime, you kind of get this this thing where it goes up suddenly. One thing that I strongly encourage everyone to do is, in these sorts of problems, it's wonderful to spend time to, this is log xt and, log of free x and log of xt. All right, it's really very valuable to plot things in multiple different ways. By hand or by the computer or both or whatnot, just to make sure that you're keeping track of what's going on. Because often what you see and what you think is very different depending on what you plot. And you'd like to be able to see your problem from as many different angles as possible. Okay. All right, I think that we've probably spent about as much time on this as we ought to. But are there any other questions about how this is going to come about? Yes?
Are there any examples of systems that use negative autoregulation and sequestration as
Okay, that's an interesting question. Although we have to be careful about, if you really want it to be more switch-like, you'd probably use positive autoregulation. I'm not aware of cases where this has been combined, although it's likely that there are some. I just don't know them. Yeah. Okay. All right, so I want to switch gears to this autoregulation, which is something, of course, that you guys just read about, and it looked like your understanding of it was solid. But we want to move through these different ideas. First, this idea of a network motif, right? And this is just the simplest example of a network motif, and it's so simple we often don't even call it a network motif. But the idea here is that we have some network, right? And it has maybe n nodes and e edges. And the example that they give, that Uri gives in his book, n was 420 and e was 520. All right. Now, and there's a basic question that if you have a network with n nodes, And then you have directed edges. Right? These are edges that have an arrow pointing on one end. Okay? Now, in that case, and if you allow self-directed edges, how many possible edges are there? Does it, anybody remember kind of what this looks like? What's that? Right. I mean, and not even in terms of the actual number. I mean, just in terms of n, for example. Total self-directed, or sorry, total directed edges. Total number of possible directed edges if we include self edges, I guess. It's n squared, right? And you can think about this in multiple ways. One is just that, well, you can start at any of the n nodes, and you can end at any of the n nodes, and that gives you n squared, right? But there's another way that you could, right, so this is E max. Right, it's indeed n squared. You could also think about this, if you like, as just saying, well, as they point out, there's sort of 1/2 n times n minus 1 is the total number of pairs in the network, right? And then for each of the pairs, you could have an edge pointing either direction, so that gives you a 2. Right? Plus, you can have n self edges, right? Right, and so this is, and of course, these are just different ways of counting n squared. But it's useful to just think about it in different ways to make sure that you're comfortable with the combinatorics of it. In particular, because next week or the week after that, we're going to be talking about network motifs in more detail, in particular the feed-forward loop, and then we really have to keep track of these sorts of combinatorics better. All right, so the way that Uri thinks about this is he says, all right, well, we're going to invoke this null model of a network, this Erdős-Renyi network, right, where we just simply say we're going to assign the E edges randomly across the E max possible, right? So of all possible edges, we're going to place the edges randomly and then generate some random network. Okay. All right. So this is basically what we typically call a random network. Okay? And that's going to allow us to define some null model, right? That if everything were random, we can ask, for example, how many self edges do we expect to get? All right. Well, one way to construct this Erdős-Renyi network, yeah.
But how do you know you don't have other kind of constraints, in this
Yeah.
system? How do you know that, transcription might require, in some cases, autoregulation, like in
Okay, although
The answers that was
Yeah.
given as a good answer was that evolution is the only thing that if you find any
Right.
network motif that to do evolution.
Okay, so that's the argument that Uri makes, and you're maybe saying maybe that's not a good argument, right? And that what Uri is saying is, well, if you see these networks more frequently than you would expect by chance, and of course you can define what you mean by chance, then you can say, oh, maybe it was selected for, it was evolved, right? And I think that in the case of this autoregulation case, I think the results are not very sensitive, but I think that this question of what the right null model is much more, is a real issue, especially when you're talking about some of these other networks. And what we'll see for the feed-forward loop is that you have to decide, well, one thing we're going to see is an Erdős-Renyi random network is very much not an accurate description of real transcription networks, right? So then you could say, well, that's not a good null model to use. And so yeah, we'll definitely spend some more time thinking about this. All right, so in the context of the Erdős-Renyi network, though, one way that you can kind of generate it is that for each of the Emax kind of possible, each of these total number of edges, you just say, okay, there's some probability that you're going to actually place a real edge there. And that probability is just E over n squared. E is the number of edges, n squared is the number of possible edges, right? So if you just create a random network in that way, then this is a manifestation of a random network that has at least the basic properties, the same number of edges as our real network. Okay. All right, and so from this, you'd say, well, how many self edges would you expect in this world, right? And well, you'd say, well, in that case, there are two ways of thinking about this, right? So you can either say, all right, we're going to take for each of the n edges, there's one possible kind of self-directed arrow, right? And for each of those cases, we can just multiply this by p, right? And this gives us e over n, right? You could also think about it as, well, yeah, we'll just say, there are multiple ways one's going to do into counting. But, right, so this, in an Erdos-Renyi network, you would say, all right, you would expect to get roughly e over n autoregulatory loops. Okay, and this is of order 1, right? So this was 1.2 in the case of the network that Uri analyzes in his book, in his paper, right? Right. Whereas how many were actually observed in the network that he studied? There were 40, right? So in the observed transcriptional network, this was in E. coli, he found that there were 40, right? And the basic statement here is that 40 is just much larger than 1.2. Okay. And you can quantify this a little bit better because it's really, you expect 1.2 plus or minus the square root of this, all right, given in a random network like this. But that means you'd expect kind of 0, 1, 2, maybe 3. Right? So 40 is definitely not what you would expect based on an Erdos-Renyi network. Okay. So this is the sense in which it's a network motif. It's that the observed network just doesn't look like a random network in this very particular sense. Okay. And of these 40, does anybody remember kind of the distribution between negative autoregulation and positive autoregulation? Yeah, I think it was like 34 and 6 was my recollection. I didn't write this down. So most of these guys had the form of X inhibiting X, but some had the form of X activating X. Right, so this was something like 34 and 6. Okay. What you would say then is that negative autoregulation is a very strong network motif, whereas positive autoregulation is a weaker network motif, but still something that occurs perhaps more than you would expect by chance. Okay. Are there any questions about that, where that argument came from, other concerns about it? All right, so then from this, then Uri says, OK, well, maybe these things evolved for a reason, right? And so what we'll do over the next half hour is just argue or discuss what possible evolutionary advantages such a network motif might have. Yeah.
Can you really propose a posteriori explanations like that?
Oh, you can propose whatever you want.
But it doesn't have much value. How it's unfalsifiable,
Yes.
You can't.
No, I would say that this is a major issue in a lot of evolutionary arguments, and I would say that the purpose of ideas and hypotheses is to get you to go and make new measurements, right? And so right now we're at the stage. Okay, well maybe these things are occurring more frequently than you'd expect by chance. So now we can just sit down and think, oh, why might, what advantage might it give? And then we can go and try to experimentally ask whether that those advantages are at least manifest in real systems. It doesn't prove that that's why they evolved, but it makes you more comfortable with the argument, right? Ultimately we assign some, we have some Bayesian probability somewhere in our brain, and the more evidence that we accumulate that's consistent with these ideas, the more likely that we think it is. But in general, you don't prove things in this sort of evolutionary space the way you prove things in many other fields. Yeah?
Isn't it, I don't know, I feel like it's hard to call this an argument. It feels more like just an observation.
Which thing is an argument versus observation?
I guess the thing is well, it should be evolutionary advantageous. That's an argument, but essentially the whole thing is an observation, and then there's a little bit of an argument in the end.
Yeah, I will let each person decide what fraction observation argument. I don't feel especially strongly about it. I do. My guess is that it did evolve for because it provides some useful function, and therefore I think it's valuable to explore what those useful functions might be. But for example, it's very hard to know which of these explanations, this thing about increasing the response time, increasing the response rate as compared to increasing robustness. how do you decide which one's more important? I mean, this gets, then I think, once again, reasonable people can disagree about these things. Yeah. All right. So there were, so first negative autoregulation, because this is the one that is the stronger network motif. All right. I think that the book does a nice, kind of a nice explanation of why it decreases the response time. But let's maybe, OK, we can just ask, OK, response time. Okay, and this is for negative autoregulation. Response time goes down. Okay, and is this for turning on, off, both, or maybe neither, or E, don't know. And I'll give you just 10 seconds to think about this. It's nice if you just remember it, but it's also maybe even better if you can figure it out, right? Because in a week, you're probably not going to just have it memorized, but you should be able to think through the logic of it and understand why this is going to be what it is. All right, so the question is, negative autoregulation, maybe it does something, maybe it decreases the response time. But does it decrease the response time for turning a gene on, for turning it off, for both? Neither, or don't know.
And when you say turning it off, what exactly is the process you're imagining?
I'm imagining a process where the expression turns off immediately. Right, so there's a signal that just stops.
Regardless of what transcription factors, okay.
Right, so then it's just, I chop up all the polymerases and no more expression.
Oh.
Which, so a signal comes and tells the polymerases to stop making, yeah. All right, so do you need more time? No. All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, so OK, we actually are all over the place on this. OK, turn to your neighbor, and you should be able to explain one way or the other what's going on.
That definitely doesn't affect it when it turns off. They stop the whole
So I thought for sure it turned off faster, but I wasn't sure about.
I never understood the answer. I don't know. I didn't get why it like this.
Maybe it is tricky to figure. I think regardless, we can make an arbitrary type of thing.
I thought it basically just reached an equilibrium. But I was like,
I remember a plot that was like increasing and then
Right. Like, why would it quickly increase? I don't understand.
I guess so. It's just, it's very, very, so it's just the response time goes down. Yeah, it's just the response time goes down.
because I thought normally like okay, well I guess it doesn't have to. I thought most of the systems have like high production rates.
Okay, let's go ahead and reconvene. And I just want to remind everybody that when I say simple regulation, I mean that there's no autoregulation, right? So it's just responding to a signal, right? That for a stable protein, the time to kind of get to, say, for example, half saturating concentration here is defined by the cell generation time. And that's true for turning on and for turning off. Right? And what was the strategy that you could use if you wanted to decrease the response time in this situation? Right, so you could increase the degradation rate, right? And does that affect the on, off, or both? Both. Okay. But there's a cost, which was what? Right, you have to make a bunch of protein, and then you're just going to chop it up right after you make it, right? So this is a there is a reasonable there is a way to make things faster, but there's a significant cost. The question is, if you have negative autoregulation, okay, so in this case, right, once again, you have x that is repressing itself. What is it that it's going to do? All right, so is it going to affect the on time, off time, or both? Let's just see where we are. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we're it's interesting. I mean, we're moving towards C, it seems. Okay, so can somebody give me an explanation for C? Did we read the chapter? No, I mean,
the chapter doesn't discuss the effect of negative autoregulation on turning off. I don't think it does.
Well, it's a good thing. Good thing we're doing that here then. All right. All right. So first of all, yeah, can somebody give the explanation? I mean, does T on go up, down, or sideways? Well, yeah. So T on go. Well, if it's a time, then it goes down. I always get this confused, right? So time is the one goes down, so the rate goes up. Right, okay, so it's negative autoregulation, it's faster turning on, we decided, right? Okay. And does somebody want to give the explanation for why this is?
Well, your equilibrium level is lower. But
yeah, there's a sense, right.
The initial...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so this is actually surprisingly difficult to explain, even though it's not a deep concept, but somehow, right. But the idea is that you start out expressing a lot, so that if you had kept on expressing at that high level, you would have done some exponential, and it would have taken cell generation time to come way up here. Right? But instead, what happens is that you shoot on up, but then once you get up here, you repress expression. So then you get an effective thing where the time that it takes you to get half of your equilibrium, that goes down. Okay. So T on here is shorter than here. Yes?
So in negative autoregulation, we're increasing what the book calls beta to have the same steady state?
That's right. So the sort of initial beta, the rate, that maximal rate of expression, that goes up in the case of negative autoregulation. But then you start repressing expression once your concentration of x here gets to some reasonable level. Right. So this is, right, so now we're just talking about production rate of x, and that's as a function of x, right? And this logic approximation is when it just is maximal until it gets to some k, and then is completely repressed. So real versions will be much smoother, but this is just useful to kind of start getting the intuition. And the idea is that you shoot up to this k, and then you stop expressing. Right. So in this limit, actually, it's not even there's a kink here because it just shoots up and then it turns around, right? But any real system will be smoother, right? Yes, question.
So to get to the same equilibrium level on autoregulation, you would need a stronger promoter.
Yes. Yeah, you want a stronger promoter because you really want to have high expression initially and then later repress that. Okay. So negative autoregulation allows you to speed up turning on. So T on goes down.
Without increasing the problem, which is a good thing because your cell would die if you produce too much problem.
Okay. So yeah, this is yes. This is a very important point which I was about to get to, right? Which is that this is something that was done. We could have done that without negative autoregulation, right? By increasing the degradation rate, right? So the question that we're bringing up here is there that same cost that we were referring to before of this futile expression of protein at equilibrium? So it's actually not, and that's and I think that this is a subtle point. You start out expressing a lot, but then later you actually bring down your rate of expression, and in any case. The rate of there's no degradation in this model right. The only effective degradation is due to the dilution, the growth of the cell, right. So given if you have the same concentration, then actually you don't make any more protein than you did here if you have the same concentration at equilibrium, right. So this is neat because this speeds up the response when you're turning on without the associated cost of making that protein and then degrading it. Any questions about that statement? Okay, so now what about off? Is the off time the same as the on time here? All right, so what sets how fast?
Should the off time be slower because you have less degradation?
Right, and in principle, is there any active degradation that we've invoked right now on this? No, I mean, of course we could have both negative autoregulation and active degradation, but in principle right now, you can have the negative autoregulation without any active degradation. Right, in that case, how long does it take for that concentration to go away when you stop expressing?
Cell generation scale.
So again, a cell generation time, right? So this thing actually looks the exact same as this. Right? Okay. So these guys are the same, whereas this one is faster than that one. Okay. Because the idea is that the best that you can, I mean, unless you're going to actively degrade it, right? All you can do is you can shut off expression, right? But then if you turn off expression on the negative autoregulation, it's the exact same thing as turning off expression in the absence of the negative. I mean, in either case, you just stop making protein, right? So the concentration just goes down because it's being diluted away during cell growth. Okay. Right. So this is saying that the response time goes down only when turning on in the case of negative autoregulation. Are there any questions about that idea? Yes?
With the negative autoregulation, in order to reach the same protein levels, you would need much greater production rates, correct?
Yeah, right. So the idea is that this beta might be, so this is the beta of negative autoregulation. It could be much larger than the beta of simple regulation in order to get to the same equilibrium. Yeah. All right. Actually, I don't want to. OK, so what about this idea of robustness? Okay. Well, here we have, this is production rate and then degradation rate. OK, so this is an alpha x. Oops. Right. And so my question here is, I told you that robustness, you have to say something is robust to something else. Yeah, question.
So my question is, in this case, you're saying that the off means signal disappeared. Right?
OK, T off is this idea of it's the T1/2. So this is the time that it takes for the protein concentration to reach half of, to go from halfway the distance from where you were to where you're going to end up.
But what
right?
if the signal not disappeared, but like to half of the original signal?
Okay, right. So yeah, so the signal could do a range of different things, and it could be that the signal just changes so that instead of going down to 0, you go down to some other value. Is that what you're imagining?
Yes.
All right. So in that case, you still go exponentially to this new value, and so actually the response time there is still actually the cell generation time. So it doesn't matter in the absence of any of these, for example, autoregulation. The characteristic time scale is always the cell generation time if it's a stable protein. It doesn't matter whether you're going up, down, or all the way to 0 or not, or All right. So the question here is, okay, X equilibrium is robust to what? Okay, and this is to small changes in what? All right. It's going to be A alpha. All right, so this is going to be our first example of an advanced use of our cards. Okay? So the way that it works is that you can choose more than one. Okay? Now this requires some manual dexterity. All right, so what you have to do is, if you think that the answer is more than one of these things, then what you have to do is show me more than one card. Okay? Right, these cards are amazing, right? You know, I mean, you can do so many different combinations. All right. I'll give you 20 seconds to think about it. Yeah.
What do those things mean?
OK. The question is, all right, the equilibrium concentration of protein X is robust, means it does not change, right, in response to small changes in what quantities, right? So if I change the degradation rate, does it change equilibrium? If I change the beta, and I'm asking it about this case here, perfect negative autoregulation, all right, just so that we can try to establish our intuition here. All right, K is this repression threshold. None means it's not robust to any of these things. DK always means don't know. Actually, I'll give you an extra 30 seconds, because this might be a... And so this one's the production rate, this one's the degradation rate. This figure might be useful to you.
Sorry, can you define K again?
Yeah, so K is the concentration of the protein X at which this super effective repression kicks in. Right? So we're assuming perfect negative autoregulation. So there's this beta is the rate of expression for low concentrations. Then the moment that you get to concentration K, you get perfect repression, so no more expression. All right, do you need more time? All right, question.
By saying that X equilibrium is robust, do you mean that when you change these parameters, X equilibrium stays exactly the same? Or
yes, we'll say it.
X equilibrium does
for now, we'll say, yeah, for what we'll mean right now is that a small change in this parameter leads to no change in X equilibrium. Now, for any real example, what we'll typically mean is it's going to be some sort of sensitivity analysis. For example, where you'll say, oh, you know, a 1% change in a parameter leads to a less than 1% change, you know, for example. But this is in this case, there's going to be no change, I'll tell you. And you know, just so we can get the intuition clear here. All right, do you need more time? All right, let's go ahead and vote. Remember, you can vote for more than one thing if you like. Ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, we got. All right, some people are using our more than one. You know, and of course I can give you a hint. The reason that I'm letting you vote more than once is because more than one thing is going to be. All right, so it's a majority of the group has got this, but not everyone. So let's discuss. But can somebody give an explanation for why both alpha and beta are going to work here?
So the equilibrium is basically when degradation equals production. So that's
all right, so I want to make sure I'm okay. The equilibrium is when the production rate is equal to the degradation rate. All right, so this is a very important thing to make sure we're on top of. And in this case, we have a very sharp kind of this production term, right? Okay, so then what happens?
Well, I mean, the solution is the intersection.
Right. So in this case, what is the equilibrium concentration?
K.
Is equal to K. All right. Now, I strongly encourage you, whenever possible, to draw things out, because this is a problem that when you have the drawing is reasonable to do, and if you don't have the drawing, you're going to get yourself tied up into weird knots. Okay? Right? And indeed, what you can see is that we can if we change alpha, what happens in this plot? Right? Changes the slope. Right? And you can see that if we change the slope by small amounts, we get no change in where this crossing point is. Right? And even for a real system, if it kind of came around, you'd see that it's going to end up being a less than proportional change in the equilibrium. Right? Okay, and what about beta? That just raises and lowers this. And again, that doesn't change the equilibrium. All right? Of course, if we change k, then we get a 1-to-1 change, right? So a 10% change in k leads to a 10% change in the equilibrium concentration of x. All right, so this is the sense in which the equilibrium concentration in negative autoregulation is robust to changes in both. They often, in the book, they say, oh, the production rate, but it's actually also, in principle, the degradation rate over some range. Right? And this could be useful because there are lots of things that are going to affect the production rate of a protein, and also the degradation rate, for that matter. Right? The division rate changes it. Whereas it may be that k is subject to less severe changes, because that's determined by, for example, the kinetics of binding of this protein to this promoter. Right? And that is perhaps less subject to changes. It could still change depending upon the pH and so forth of the interior of the cell. But at least it's probably not subject to the big changes that alpha and beta are going to be going to experience. Right? So the argument that Uri makes for why it is that we see so much negative autoregulation in the cell is because it both increases the rate that the cell can respond to changes in the on direction, at least, but also that it makes the concentration of the protein more robust to changes in several of the parameters that govern the equilibrium concentration. Okay. And once again, you can argue about which one of these is more important, but I think they're both likely playing a significant role in different cases. Okay. All right, I'm going to want to move on, but I will tell you that only over some range of these parameters, alpha, beta, k, will this thing be robust. Okay. So for example, if this comes up too high, we're going to lose this phenomenon of robustness. Okay, so I expect you to be able to tell me in some later date the conditions in which that might happen. Okay? And I'm available for the next half hour after class. So if you do not know what I'm talking about right there, please hang out with me after, and I'll tell you the solution to that question on the exam. Okay? All right. All right. But I do want to talk about positive autoregulation, because this is another interesting beast. Right? So if negative autoregulation has those nice properties, then you can imagine that positive autoregulation will have some drawbacks in the same kind of ways. All right? But it leads to some other very, I think, interesting, just qualitative features. Okay? All right, so this is positive autoregulation. All right, so we have some x that is activating itself. And often we think about cases where it's activating its own expression in a cooperative fashion. Right? In particular, we might assume that x dot is equal to, for example, some beta naught plus some beta 1 of some cooperative thing here, where n might be 2, 3, 4. Right? And then again, minus alpha x. Right? Now, if you just look at this, you might think, oh, I don't know what this is going to do, and so forth. But you've got to draw things out. Right? Once you draw it, then you'll see that it's pretty straightforward. All right, so again, this is the production and the degradation rates. All right, so that's production. And degradation, for example, might look like this. All right, so this is the production. This is the degradation. All right, so that's the alpha x term. All right. One question would be, how many fixed points does this system have? So fixed point means that if you started right there, and in the absence of any noise, you would stay right there. Okay, so it's including both stable and unstable fixed points. Can you read that? All right, I'll give you 15 seconds to count them. All right. All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, it seems like we have pretty good agreement that there are indeed 3 fixed points. All right. Once again, the fixed point is where these curves cross. Okay. So we have one right here, one here, and one here. All right. Now, how many are stable? We're going to do this verbally. Ready? 3, 2, 1, 2. All right, let's try it again. Ready? 3, 2, 1, 2. Yeah, the thing is you get so used to the cards, it's hard to speak. Yeah, okay. So they're the ones on the ends of the stable ones. All right, and you can just see here that around this point, the production rate over here is more than the degradation rate. That means that if you leave that fixed point, you're going to get pushed away. So it's very nice to draw these little arrows here to make one happy. Okay. All right, so this thing here is stable, unstable, and again stable. All right. Now, the reason we call this bistability is because there are 2 stable fixed points. All right. This is important because this phenomenon is the basic dynamical system origin of memory. Okay? Now, it's not obvious how memory comes from this. So memory is in general this idea that the gene network or the cell can retain a memory of its past state. Okay? And we're going to see examples of this over the next few weeks. But just to be clear, if, for example, we imagine a situation where the alpha changes, okay, it could be division rate, for example, high food, low food environments, what we can do is we can plot. Often you would plot, for example, the equilibrium, but that's a little bit trickier. So I'm just going to plot the production rate as a function of alpha. Okay. Now, the question is, if we change alpha, what's going to happen? Right. Now, for a fixed alpha, you can see already that there are 2 different production rates that are stable in this case. Right? But what happens if we increase alpha? So we increase the growth rate, so it goes like this. Right? Can that change the number of fixed points? All right. And indeed, what you can see is that as this line gets steeper here, eventually you only have a single fixed point, and it's stable. Right? And that's known as a bifurcation in the dynamics of the system. Okay? So this is for large alpha, you end up, okay, and just to be clear, this is beta naught down here. And then up here is the beta 1, right? So what we can do is we know that beta naught is where we get for large alpha. All right. Now for small alpha, do we end up getting another? Right, we get another bifurcation. So actually, there's only again one stable point up here at small alpha, right? And what we're going to get is what's known as a fold bifurcation. Where solid lines denote stable points, stable fixed points. Dashed lines represent unstable fixed points. Okay? This is stable, and the dashed is unstable. There's some region of alpha conditions where the system is bistable, but then outside of that, it's just monostable. Okay? Can somebody explain why this thing? Why I might make the argument that this thing displays memory? Maybe one of those 2 is fine. But any new people want to explain my thought process? No. All right, maybe you.
Okay. Well, so depending on whether we had high degradation or low degradation rates in the past, will be on the lower or the upper range of that
Exactly.
if we return to normal.
That's right. So the argument here is that let's say that this is some normal condition. So this is where you are right now, for example. I don't know. Now, depending upon whether you're sitting here or here, that's perhaps giving you some information about the past state of the cell, right? Because if you were here, that means, oh, maybe in the past you were out at high degradation rates, whereas if you were here, maybe you were at low. And in particular, you could reset things, right? If you start here, then you can reset this memory module by coming over here. Then, once you get to this point here, that's the bifurcation of the dynamics. It's a fold bifurcation. Then you come up here, and now you'll retain this state in principle until you get over here. Of course, there could be stochastic switching dynamics. We're going to talk a lot about that in the coming weeks. But at least in the limit of low rates of stochastic switching, then this represents some sort of memory module, kind of the simplest version of it. I'd say that in the cell, most examples of such memory modules involve not just positive feedback of one protein activating itself, although this happens, but often through a whole network where the one protein activates another, and then you come back. Or it could be repressing, and that 2 knots is a 2 negatives is a positive, right? Just like 3 lefts is a right. Okay. Right. Okay. So, are there any questions about what the sense in which this thing can serve as a basic memory module? This thing is maybe not the most interesting example of it because alpha is such a global parameter, but you can also get similar dynamics as a function of, for example, the galactose in the concentration of some sugar in your media, right? So, given that different small molecules such as food sources can act as inputs into these gene networks, you can also get these sorts of dynamics as a function of what you might call, some simple external molecule, right? Which is nice because that means that you can have such, memory modules that are really independent of all the other memory modules that are going on in your cell. Whereas if you had to vary alpha, then this changes everything, right? Whereas if it's just concentration of some sugar outside, then you can imagine that could be very useful to retain a memory of what the cell has encountered in the past. Okay. All right. So today what we've been able to do is analyze something about possible evolutionary explanations for why autoregulation is as commonly observed as it is. Right? So negative autoregulation is the one that's observed perhaps most frequently. And that, I think, has some very clear purposes. And this idea of the concentration being robust to other biochemical parameters, I think, is a big idea. We're going to see this idea of robustness crop up multiple times over the course of this semester. And I think that it's nice to think about robustness in this case because it's perhaps the simplest example of how robustness and that as an approach can be useful as a way of thinking about a problem. We're later going to be thinking about robustness in the context of perfect adaptation in chemotaxis, where bacteria try to find food. And there, I think everything is more subtle because already the base phenomenon that is robust is a kind of a form of robustness, and so it kind of gets you mixed up. So I think that it's good to be very clear about what robustness means here, so that we can use that to think about robustness in other biological functions. All right, with that, have a good weekend. Good luck on the problem set, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Yep.
Sure.